What do you picture when you think of a war horse? A majestic image, mane flussoing in the wind, a valiant rider on its back, charging into battle like an unstoppable force. Movies, books, ancient paintings, they all paint that picture, a symbol of courage and power. But that's the human lens, a lens burnished by glory and praise. The truth. Try looking through our eyes, the eyes of the actual chargers. You won't see a halo of light, but the sheer terror as cannons rip the sky apart, the suffocating, nauseating stench of blood, a mix of comrade and foe. You won't hear a mighty, triumphant neigh, but a whimper stifled by mud and exhaustion, the sickening crack of bone under a cannon's wheel. I am Windrider, or, well, that's the name they gave me when I was still a beacon of hope. Now, I'm just a whisper from the past, a testament to the truth that being a war horse is, in reality, a life sentence of unending misery. Join me as we pull back the glittering curtain of deceit so you can understand why so-called glory is merely the gilded cageBars for a lifetime of torment. So, we've journeyed through some of the darkest corners of a war horse's existence. Where are you all watching this from, by the way? UK? The US? Perhaps somewhere in Europe? What time is it where you are right now? Drop a comment below and let me know. I'm genuinely curious to see how far our community stretches. BUT, hold on. Don't go anywhere just yet. What's coming up next is where the truly mind-blowing details lie, the kind I'm certain will make you pause and think. We're about to uncover those rare, fleeting moments of humanity that flickered. Amidst the brutal chaos of the battlefield, did any rider truly love their horse? Or were we all just tools? And crucially, Windrider's ultimate fate, is there even a sliver of light? Or is it just one more tragedy in a long line? Trust me, what you're about to see will fundamentally change how you view loyalty and sacrifice. If what I've shared so far has resonated with you, please don't hesitate to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a massive source of motivation for me to keep bringing you unique stories like this. And most importantly, please watch until the very end so you don't miss a single one of these powerful moments. Believe me, you won't regret it. Now, let's continue our journey. Part 1. The glorious beginning of my utter misery freedom gets cancelled. Okay, let me lay it on you straight. Before this whole Windrider gig became synonymous with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the delightful symphony of men screaming their lungs out, I actually had a life, a pretty sweet one, if I do say so myself. Imagine this endless, rolling plains, the kind of green that makes your eyes sing. Grass. All you can eat buffet 24/7, no reservations needed. Crystal clear streams, colder and more refreshing than any fancy bottled water you bipeds pay a fortune for. Yeah, I was living the dream, the equine equivalent of a trust fun kid with a killer metabolism. My mother. Picture a queen, all sleek coat and eyes that held the wisdom of the wind. She taught me the important stuff, the kind of life skills your human schools only dream of. Son, she'd neigh. Probably, if we actually spoke in sonnets. That patch of purple flowers. Pretty, but it'll give you the trots for a week. Hear that rustle in the tall grass. Could be a snack. Could be something that wants to make you a snack. Pay attention. And the running. Oh, the glorious, unadulterated joy of stretching your legs, wind whipping through your mane. feeling like you could outrun the horizon itself. I was the king of my own, fuzzy, four-legged world, bowing to no one. I answered to the sun, the moon, and maybe the occasional particularly grumpy badger. But, and isn't there always a but? When things are going too well. It's like the universe has a quota for happiness, and mine was apparently maxed out. That's so-called freedom. Turns out it was as fragile as a politician's promise. Then they showed up. The two-legged nightmares. Still gives me shivers. They smelled wrong, a weird, sharp, metallic scent mixed with something unpleasantly sweaty. And the noise. Good grief, the noise. Shouts that could curdle milk, and the crack of whips slicing through the air like angry snakes. Suddenly, our peaceful, hippie commune of a herd was thrown into utter chaos. It was like someone had yelled, "Free carrots," in a crowded stable, only instead of carrots, it was sheer, unadulterated panic. Instinct, that glorious, often life-saving internal alarm bell, screamed one thing: run. And run we did. Foals tripping over their own gangly legs, stallions trying to look brave while clearly wanting to pee themselves, mares desperately trying to keep their little ones close. It was a stampede, a thundering, earth-shaking mess of hooves and terror. But see, there it is again, that party, pooping conjunction. These two-leggers were annoyingly persistent. And clever, in a low, down, sneaky sort of way. They had ropes, lots of ropes, and nets, and pointy sticks. It was hardly a fair fight, was it? We had speed and a general desire not to be turned into glue. They had strategy and a complete lack of concern for our personal space. I saw Cloud, a filly I used to race with, get tangled in one of those damned nets. The look in her eyes, pure, unadulterated terror as she thrashed and bucked. But it was no use. They swarmed her. It was a disgusting, efficient, and utterly heartbreaking display of might makes right. And me? Oh, I gave it the old college try. I ran like my tail was on fire. I dodged, I weaved. I probably looked quite heroic for about 30 seconds. I could feel my lungs burning, my muscles screaming in protest. Just a little further. I told myself, just over that ridge, and I'm home free. Famous last thoughts, right? But then came the searing pain. A rough, coarse rope biting into my neck, yanking me zalgies off my feet with a force that knocked the wind and most of my dignity right out of me. Face plant in the dirt. Classy. The taste of dust and humiliation filled my mouth. I tried to scramble up, to make a break for it, but heavy hands, reeking of that weird human smell, pressed me down. That rope, that cursed, scratchy, life-altering piece of hemp wasn't just a physical restraint. Oh no, it was a symbol. It was the universe's way of saying, "Party's over, pal. Welcome to the suck." It severed me from my past, from my mother, from the green fields and the open sky. In that instant, I stopped being Windrider, free spirit of the plains. I became prisoner number. Well, they didn't bother with numbers. I was just the new one. My mother's desperate whinny as they dragged me away, a sound raw with anguish, still echoes in my quieter nightmares. It's a special kind of torture, that sound. It's the soundtrack to the exact moment your soul gets a going out of business sign slapped on it. The journey to what they so charmingly called the training facility was a delight, let me tell you. And by delight, I mean a special kind of hell reserved for creatures who'd clearly annoyed a deity in a past life. We were crammed into these wooden boxes on wheels, so tight you could barely shift your weight without starting a multi-horse pile up. The air was thick with the smell of fear, stale sweat, and other, less pleasant, bodily functions. Food, water. Apparently, those were luxury items, doled out with the kind of generosity you'd expect from a starving wolf guarding its last scrap. Day after day, we jolted along, the weaker ones, the ones injured during our enthusiastic recruitment, starting to falter. I saw a young colt, no older than I was, just give up. One morning, he was just lying there, his breathing shallow, his eyes dull. But because why would anything be simple? Did our captors show a flicker of concern? A moment of, oh dear, perhaps we're overdoing it. Of course not. To them, we were inventory. Potential assets. If a few units didn't make it, well, that was just the cost of doing business. Therefore, the first great lesson of my new life was hammered home: a horse's life is cheap. Cheaper than dirt, probably, because at least you can grow things in dirt. Any lingering spark of hope, any foolish notion that this was all a terrible misunderstanding and I'd soon be back nibbling on clover with Mom. Well, that spark was systematically extinguished with every miserable, bone-jarring mile. We had no idea where we were going, no clue what awaited us. Just a gnawing, ever-present fear and a profound sense of powerlessness. We thought being captured was the worst of it. Yay. Cute, right? But that, my friends, was merely the appetizer, the warm-up act for a full-blown opera of suffering. The free plains were now a distant, dreamlike memory, a paradise lost. And the training facility. Oh, that was where the real fun was about to begin. It turns out, why it sucked to be me was a saga with many, many chapters yet to unfold. And I was just getting to the good, awful parts. Part 2. Training, or how they beat the wild out of you, one soul, crushing lesson at a time. So, after the scenic, not at all traumatic cross-country adventure, we finally arrived at our new home, away from hell's, the training facility. I use air quotes around training, because what they did there felt less like education and more like a systematic dismantling of everything that made you, well, you. If you happen to be a creature, Atsu, enjoyed things like personal space, free will, or not having heavy, sweaty things strapped to your back. The place itself was a masterpiece of utilitarian misery. Endless rows of cramped, splintery stalls. A pervasive aroma of old straw, nervous horse sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of fear that never quite seemed to wash away. The soundtrack was a delightful mix of impatient human shouts, the occasional thud of a hoof against wood, usually followed by more shouting, and the mournful, defeated whinnies of creatures who were clearly having a worse day than you were, which, frankly, was saying something. The first order of business, apparently, was to break us. Charming term, isn't it? Sounds less like a gentle introduction to a new lifestyle and more like something you do to a particularly stubborn donkey with a sledgehammer. And honestly, the sledgehammer might have been kinder. But because, of course, there's a but, their methods were a bit more nuanced. Insidious, even. It started with the halter, a seemingly innocuous contraption of leather straps. No big deal. I probably thought, in my naive, pre-broken state, how bad can a glorified necklace be? Famous last thoughts. Part 2. The moment they tried to slip that thing over my head, every alarm bell in my wild, horse brain went off like a fire drill in a fireworks factory. My instinct was to rear, to strike out, to say, in no uncertain equine terms, "Get that thing away from my face, you two-legged freak." This, it turned out, was not the correct response. The correct response, I soon learned, involved a lot more standing still and a lot less trying to plant your hooves in someone's chest. My initial protests were met with a confusing and frankly terrifying combination of soothing noises, clearly a lie, and the sharp, stinging kiss of a whip, definitely not a lie. Therefore, a pattern began to emerge: wild instinct, tech pain, cowed submission, slightly less pain, or at least a temporary reprieve. It was a brilliant, if diabolical, form of operant conditioning. Then came the saddle. Oh, the indignity. Imagine someone deciding that your back, your perfectly good, previously unencumbered back, would now serve as a mobile lazy boy for a human. It was heavy. It was awkward. It smelled of old leather and someone else's sweat, which is never a pleasant combination. The first time they cinched that girth tight, I thought my ribs were going to crack. I bucked. I twisted. I did my best impression of a rodeo bronc with a particularly angry bee in its ear. But, so you're getting the hang of this, right? My spirited display of, "Please get this torture device off me," only resulted in more yanking on the lead rope, more sharp commands, and the ever-present threat of that damned whip. Slowly, painstakingly, day by agonizing day, they chipped away at my spirit. They didn't want a partner, they wanted a tool. A living, breathing, occasionally snorting vehicle. The wild, untamed part of me, the part that yearned for the open plains and the taste of freedom, was being systematically starved, beaten, and cajoled into a dark corner of my soul. And then, just when you thought you were getting the hang of one particular form of misery, they'd introduce a new one. Variety, they say, is the spice of life. In this case, it was just different flavors of awful. Let's talk about the bit. A cold, hard piece of metal shoved into your mouth. Imagine trying to eat, drink, or even breathe properly with a chunk of iron clanking against your teeth and pressing on your tongue. It made me drool, like a Saint Bernard in a heat wave. It made me want to toss my head and scream. But, yes, again, any attempt to dislodge this oral invader was met with a sharp tug on the reins, sending jolts of pain through my jaw and skull. Therefore, I learned to tolerate it, to let it sit there. A constant, metallic reminder of my subjugation. You start to feel less like a noble steed and more like a piece of complicated, fleshy machinery. And the training for actual combat. That was a whole new level of, why does my life suck so profoundly? They'd clang swords together near your head, fire off loud, startling blanks from those noisy stick, things humans call guns, and make other humans scream like banshees. All while expecting you to stand there like a furry, four-legged statue. My natural reaction, to bolt, to get as far away from that cacophony of impending doom as humanly or equinely possible. But no, that was bad. That earned you a yank on the bit that made your eyes water, and a whack on the rump that made you question all your life choices. Leading up to that point, we had to learn to charge into mock battles, to navigate obstacle courses designed by someone who clearly hated horses, or at least had a very warped sense of fun. We jumped over things that looked suspiciously like they could impale you. We waded through mud pits that tried to suck your hooves off. All the while, a human was perched on top, yanking on your mouth, kicking your sides, and generally making an already unpleasant experience even more so. And then there were the other horses. Some were just as terrified and confused as I was. Others, the ones who'd been broken longer, had a dull, resigned look in their eyes that was almost scarier than the fear. It was a preview of coming attractions, a glimpse into my own bleak future. It wasn't just the physical abuse, though that was plentiful. It was the psychological warfare, the constant pressure, the removal of all choice, the slow, grinding erosion of your identity. They didn't just want to control my body, they wanted to own my mind. They wanted to replace my instincts with their commands. But deep down, a tiny, defiant spark still flickered. It was a pathetic little ember, granted, mostly buried under a mountain of fear and exhaustion, but it was there. It whispered of green grass and open skies, a life where the only reins were the ones you set for yourself. I saw other horses break completely. Not just their spirit, but their bodies too. A beautiful chestnut mare, fiery and proud when she first arrived, just gave up. She refused to eat, refused to move. One morning, she was gone. No explanation, no ceremony, just an empty stall. Therefore, the lesson was clear: compliance was survival. Resistance, in any meaningful form, was a one-way ticket to a very unpleasant, and likely very short, future. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of discomfort, fear, and reluctant obedience. Wake up sore, get prodded and poked. Have things strapped to you. Get ridden until your legs ached and your back throbbed. Get yelled at. Maybe get a meager ration of hay if you were good. Repeat. It was a masterclass in how to take a proud, free creature and turn it into a quivering, anxious wreck who jumped at loud noises and flinched at sudden movements. They called it training. I called it a slow, agonizing death of the soul. They were preparing us for glory, for the of serving in battle. But all I could see was a future filled with more pain, more fear, and the ever-present shadow of a violent, pointless end. If this was what being useful to humans meant, then frankly, I'd rather have been a particularly uninteresting rock. At least rocks got to stay in one place and didn't have to wear a stupid piece of metal in their mouths. Yeah, being a warhorse in training. It sucked. Royally. And the truly terrifying part, this was just the beginning of the suck fest. The main event was still to come. Part 3. The main event, where glory goes to die, and so do you. Right. So, after our delightful, extended stay at Camp Break, your spirit, and possibly your legs, it was showtime, the big leagues. The moment all those charming lessons in how to tolerate pointy things coming at your face were supposed to pay off. We were off to war, baby, and if you thought training was a barrel of laughs spoiler, it wasn't. Then actual, honest, to goodness, people trying to actively alive you war was like diving headfirst into a septic tank filled with angry badgers and rusty nails. It took the baseline, suck, of our existence and cranked it up to 11, then broke the knob off. The pre-game show, also known as the March to the Front, was an experience in itself. Picture this endless days of plotting, and then, for a change of pace, some more plotting. Sometimes the sun would try to cook us in our own hides. Other times, the sky would open up and dump enough water on us to make Noah consider building a sequel. You know what's fun? Marching for 10 hours with hooves caked in mud so thick it feels like you're wearing concrete booties, while a grumpy human with questionable hygiene sits on your already aching back. Good times. Food and water. Oh, those became mythical creatures, whispered about in hushed, desperate whinnies around the meager campfires. Did you see that guy? He actually got a whole handful of oats. The rations, when they did appear, were usually about as appealing as weak, old roadkill. We weren't exactly feasting like kings, more like desperately trying to extract enough calories from bits of straw and suspiciously gray mush to keep from collapsing. And then there was the gear. My rider, let's call him Sir Sweats, Lot, seemed to believe he needed to bring everything he owned, plus a few anvils for good measure. His lumpy, armored backside became a permanent fixture on my spine, a constant, unwelcome pressure. Add to that his shield, his sword, which he'd occasionally, accidentally, poke me with, his pointy helmet, which he'd bang against my head when he got excited, and a rucksack filled with God knows what heavy, clanky objects. My back wasn't just aching, it was staging a full-blown, unionized protest. But, Sal's, and you know this was coming, right? Were there any equine chiropractors on staff? Any offers of a nice, soothing liniment rub? Please. We were the organic, four-legged equivalent of a pickup truck, expected to haul their crap without complaint, running on fumes and stubbornness. Naturally, because life wasn't quite miserable enough, disease decided to throw its hat into the ring. Imagine 1,000 sweaty, unwashed bodies. See, both human and horsed, crammed together, sharing the same questionable water sources and sleeping in fields that doubled as latrines. It was a veritable petri dish of unpleasantness, cause that sounded like you were trying to hack up a lung, fevers that made your teeth chatter, weird rashes that made you want to rub yourself against a cheese grater for relief. I watched, helpless, as strong, proud horses that had survived the training, just withered away. Their eyes would get that dull, distant look. Their coats would lose their shine, and one morning, they just wouldn't get up. Therefore, a charming new fear was added to our repertoire. You could die a slow, undignified death from some random bug before you even got a chance to be heroically elf, or, more likely, unheroically impaled by an enemy spear. The glamour of war, folks. It's truly breathtaking. As we lumbered ever closer to where the alleged fun was supposed to happen, the vibe shifted. The air got thick, not just with dust and the smell of too many unbathed creatures, but with a palpable tension. It was like the feeling you get right before a massive thunderstorm, but instead of rain, you were expecting a downpour of pointy, metal objects and screaming. We'd hear these distant rumbles, these muffled thuds that would make the ground hum. The humans would get all twitchy, their eyes darting around. Our riders would try to be all cool and collected, patting our necks and murmuring things like, "Easy there, Windrider, ol' boy." But their hands were clammy, and their voices had that strained, trying too hard to sound calm quality. They weren't fooling us. We could smell their fear. It was a sharp, sour note in the olfactory orchestra of misery, blending beautifully with the aroma of stale leather, horse manure, and impending doom. And then, it was the day. The day of the actual, no, take backs. This is really happening, isn't it? Battle. You could feel it in the damp, pre-dawn air. A nervous, crackling energy that made your skin prickle. The humans were even more fidgety than usual, strapping on extra layers of metal like they were preparing for a very aggressive hailstorm. They were sharpening their pointy sticks with a grim, focused intensity that did not bode well for anyone on the receiving end. They looked, to be frank, like a bunch of people who knew they were about to have a spectacularly bad day and were grimly determined to drag everyone else down with them. Which, included us. Lucky us. Lining up was a unique form of torture. Imagine being squished between two other equally terrified, oversized, sweaty animals, all of you trying not to accidentally kick each other while simultaneously trying not to have a full-blown panic attack. The noise was already building into a chaotic crescendo. The metallic jangle of harnesses and armor, the nervous snorts and whickers of hundreds of anxious horses, the low, guttural murmur of human voices trying to sound braver than they felt, and the occasional, ear-splitting blast from a war horn that made you want to launch yourself into the stratosphere. In the distance, across a field that suddenly looked way too small, was the enemy. Another blurry line of antsy humans, and even antsier horses, all presumably feeling the same delightful cocktail of dread and adrenaline. And this was a but that felt like a brick wall. There was no escape. No, you know what, I think I left the stove on. Excuses. The only path was forward, directly into the gaping, pointy, toothed maw of whatever fresh hell awaited us. The signal. A collective roar from the human ranks, a cacophony of trumpets and horns that probably sounded incredibly inspiring to them, but to us just sounded like a very loud, very aggressive dinner, bell announcing that we were on the menu. And then the world exploded into motion. If you can picture 1,000 panicked lawnmowers all trying to escape a burning shed at the same time, while being ridden by angry monkeys with pointy sticks, you're getting close. The ground didn't just shake, it roared. A tidal wave of horseflesh and terrified human determination surged forward. Dust and debris kicked up by 1,000 hooves created a choking, blinding cloud that made it hard to see, hard to breathe. The noise was an all-consuming entity, the thunder of hooves, the high-pitched, almost inhuman screams of men, the sickeningly familiar clang of metal on metal that was growing louder and more personal with every stride. My rider, Sir Sweats, Lot, was bellowing something incoherent, probably something deeply profound like "Arg," or, for the king and slightly more, oats than usual. I couldn't be sure. My brain had switched to survival mode, which mostly involved trying not to trip over my own feet, or the rapidly accumulating obstacles, namely, other falling horses and humans. But, and this is where the suck truly achieves artistic expression, charging headlong into a line of people who are actively trying to turn you into an equine shish kebab is, to put it mildly, a suboptimal life choice. The impact, when our line met theirs, was less a clash and more a multi-horse and human pile up of screaming agony. Horses shrieked a sound that will curdle your blood and haunt your nightmares, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and pain. Men screamed too, but their screams were different, sharper tinged with a desperate fury or a sudden, gurgling finality. I saw horses go down as if poleaxed, legs buckling, riders catapulted through the air like badly thrown rag dolls. I felt a warm, sticky spray hit my flank and tried very, very hard not to think about what it was. Ignorance, in this particular instance, felt like a superpower. The chaos was a living, breathing monster. There was no discernible order, no grand strategy visible from my vantage point, which was mostly the rump of the horse in front of me and the occasional horrifying glimpse of a sword whistling past my ear. It was a swirling, heaving, grunting, screaming vortex of violence. Arrows rained down like metallic locusts, thudding into flesh and armor with sickening thwacks. I felt one rip through the edge of my ear, a fraction of an inch closer, and it would have been my eye. Good times. Spears, long and cruelly barbed, thrust out from the melee, seeking soft bellies and unprotected flanks. Swords, those elegant instruments of butchery, flashed and whirled, leaving crimson trails in their wake. Therefore, every single fiber of my being, every instinct honed over millennia of survival, was screaming, "Turn around, you idiot, run, get out of this slaughterhouse." But the enthusiastic lunatic on my back, bless his ill-fitting armor, had a different agenda. He was a dervish of kicks, yanks, and incomprehensible battle cries, urging me deeper, ever deeper into the heart of the bloody mess. I was no longer Windrider, the fleet-footed ghost of the plains. I was a battering ram with anxiety issues, a furry, four-legged lawnmower designed to cut a swath through other terrified creatures, a deeply unwilling cog in a vast, clanking, blood-splattered machine of human conflict. I remember the jarring, bone-shaking impact as I slammed into another horse, the jolt nearly sending Sir Sweat's lot into low orbit. I remember the smell, oh God, the smell of fresh blood, coppery and thick, a smell that would forever be burned into my olfactory memory. The official perfume of why my life is a waking nightmare. The things I witnessed, they don't show you this in the heroic tapestries, do they? A beautiful dapple, gray mare, her eyes wide with disbelief and agony as a spear pinned her to the churned up earth. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, his face a frozen mask of terror as he slid silently from his saddle, a dark stain blooming on his tunic. The ground itself transformed into a treacherous, nightmarish landscape, a Jackson Pollock painting rendered in mud, blood, and the scattered, broken bodies of the fallen. And then, the sounds. Beyond the clash of steel and the roar of voices, there were the more intimate, more horrifying noises, the wet, tearing sound of blades finding flesh, the sickening crunch of bone, the high, thin whinnies of horses in their death throes, the low, bubbling moans of men bleeding out onto the indifferent dirt. It was a butcher's concert, and we were the unwilling, terrified instruments. At some point, a searing, white, hot agony exploded in my right shoulder. It felt like someone had jabbed a flaming poker deep into my muscle and then twisted it for good measure. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from my throat, and stumbled violently, my front leg threatening to buckle. Sir Sweats! Lot swore a blue streak, yanking brutally on the bit, hauling my head up, forcing me to stay on my feet, to keep moving. Adrenaline, bless its stupid, short-sighted heart, flooded my system, dulling the worst of the immediate pain. But I knew I knew I was badly hurt. I could feel the warmth of my own blood, slick and sticky, running down my leg, a crimson testament to just how much this whole war thing sucked. But was there time for a medical check up? A moment to whimper pathetically. Don't be daft. The murderous carousel just kept on spinning. How long did it last? Minutes. Hours. An eternity spent in a very specific, very pointy, very loud corner of hell. Time became a meaningless concept. My lungs felt like they were on fire. My muscles were trembling bundles of overstretched agony. The taste of blood mine, others, who could tell anymore, and churned, up dirt was a constant, vile presence in my mouth. I just kept going, driven by some deeply buried survival instinct, by the desperate, frantic urgings of the human on my back, and perhaps by the sheer, idiotic momentum of the slaughter. Therefore, each hoofbeat was a gamble against a gruesome end, each ragged breath a tiny, stolen defiance against the overwhelming tide of death. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the rhythm of the chaos began to change. The relentless forward pressure eased, just a fraction. The screams took on a different timbre, less battle rage, more, oh crap, we're losing, panic. One side, it seemed, had finally had enough of this particular brand of organized mayhem and was starting to break. My rider, who, to my unending astonishment, was still attached to me and mostly in one piece, albeit looking like he'd been dragged backwards through a hedge by a pack of very angry wolves, started to guide me, or rather, yank me towards the less densely populated areas of the carnage. The immediate aftermath, once the adrenaline started to recede like a particularly unpleasant tide, was a fresh circle of hell. The silence, or rather, the lack of battle noise, was almost as deafening as the previous din. It was replaced by a new soundscape. The groans of the wounded, the occasional, chillingly lonely whinny of a horse searching for its herd or its fallen rider, and the buzzing. Oh, the buzzing. The flies were already arriving, a macabre welcoming committee for the newly deceased. The field that had been, just hours before, a relatively unremarkable stretch of turf, was now a grotesque tableau of death and suffering. Bodies, contorted into the unnatural postures of violent ends, lay strewn across the landscape like carelessly discarded toys. Human bodies. And so many horse bodies. Their sleek coats were matted with blood and mud. Their once proud necks were broken. Their eyes, if they weren't mercifully closed, stared up at the sky with a vacant, glassy indifference. This was it. This was the glory. This was the honor. A stinking, fly-blown bunyard. But and this is the truly twisted part for the humans who had won. There was a grim, exhausted kind of elation. For those who had lost, there was only the bitter taste of defeat and the frantic scramble to escape. And for us, the surviving equine heroes, we were just there, battered, bleeding, traumatized beyond words, and still utterly, completely, at the mercy of the creatures who had turned our world into this charnel house. The humans, naturally, attended to their own wounded first. Shouts for chirurgeon, sickening, which sounded suspiciously like surgeon, only with more suffering involved, and cries of pain echoed across the despoiled field. We horses, those of us still on our feet, were largely left to our own devices, unless we were inconveniently standing on a wounded human or blocking a cart. Some riders, if they were capable, and not too busy congratulating themselves on not being dead, might give their mount a cursory once over. But many were too dazed, too injured, or too high on the fumes of victory or defeat to care much. I watched, a dull ache spreading through my wounded shoulder, as a soldier, his face a mask of grim pragmatism, walked over to a magnificent black stallion. The stallion was down, one of its forelegs bent at a horrifying, impossible angle. The soldier didn't hesitate. He drew a heavy pistol. There was a single, flat crack. The stallion's proud head slumped to the ground, putting him out of his misery. They called it. It looked a lot like getting rid of damaged goods, to me. A horse that couldn't carry a rider or pull a cannon was just another mouth to feed, another burden. And in war, burdens were dealt with swiftly and unsentimental. Why? Therefore, the fear didn't magically evaporate when the last sword was sheathed. It just mutated, becoming a cold, gnawing dread about what came next. My shoulder throbbed with a deep, insistent pain. I was losing blood, not a torrent, but a steady, worrying trickle. But was anyone rushing over with bandages and soothing words? Was there a Emmons A's SH unit for badly used war horses? Don't make me laugh. I was still upright. I could still, presumably, be made to walk. That, it seemed, was the gold standard of equine healthcare on the battlefield. If it ain't dead, it ain't done. Later, maybe hours later, some overworked, underpaid farrier might glance at it, splash some foul, smelling, stinging concoction on it, and declare it good enough. Or maybe not. Such was the glittering, glamorous existence of a creature of war. You were a symbol of martial prowess when you were charging into a wall of pointy things, a piece of slightly damaged equipment when you got hurt, and a forgotten pile of bones when you finally, inevitably, succumbed. The stench. The stench was a physical presence. It coated your tongue, clogged your nostrils, settled in the back of your throat like a vile, syrupy poison. The sweet, cloying aroma of spilled blood, the sharper tang of fear, sweat, the underlying notes of excrement and unwashed bodies, all mingling into a perfume of pure, unadulterated horror. This was the grandeur of battle they wrote poems about. This reeking field of human and equine offal. This chorus of suffering. This profound, overwhelming sense of utter, pointless waste. If this was what glory smelled like, I wanted no part of it. Give me the clean scent of rain on dry earth, the fragrance of wildflowers, the honest smell of a well, kept stable, and this was the truly soul-crushing, but my preferences were, as always, irrelevant. The war wasn't over. This was just one bloody, stinking, traumatizing act in a much longer, much suckier play. There would be more marches, more battles, more fear, more pain, more opportunities to become another anonymous casualty, another patch of disturbed earth on some godforsaken field. Yeah, it really, truly, profoundly, and in every conceivable way, sucked to be a war horse, and the absolute worst part of it all, I was still breathing, which meant I was signed up for the sequel. Lucky, lucky me. Part 4. The lull, or when you're not actively dying, you're just slowly rotting. So, the battle was over. The immediate, pointy, stick in your face kind of danger had receded, replaced by the dull, throbbing ache of wounds, the gnawing emptiness of exhaustion, and the delightful ambience of a freshly minted graveyard. You'd think, wouldn't you, that after surviving that particular brand of hell, there might be a bit of a break. a chance to recuperate. Maybe a nice, long nap in a field that wasn't currently doubling as a crime scene. Ha! You optimistic fool. This was war. Remember, the suck never truly slept. It just took on different, occasionally less overtly stabby, forms. The first charming phase of the lull was usually dealing with the immediate aftermath. My shoulder, where that enthusiastic enemy spear, Chucker, had left his calling card, was a mess. It was swollen, tender to the touch, and throbbed with a rhythm that perfectly matched my burgeoning hatred for all things two-legged and warlike. Eventually, some overworked, enthused human with hands like sandpaper and the bedside manner of a particularly grumpy badger came around. He didn't so much treat the wound as aggressively poke at it with a dirty rag soaked in something that smelled like regret and burned like the fires of Hades. But because there's always a but when it comes to equine healthcare in a war zone, I was still standing, still breathing, still, theoretically, capable of carrying Sir Sweat's lot and his impressive collection of medieval Tupperware. Therefore, in their esteemed medical opinion, I was fine, or, more accurately, not dead enough to bother with properly. The days immediately following a battle were a special kind of bleak. If we weren't immediately marching off to find another group of people to try and murder, we were stuck in some godforsaken, hastily erected camp. These camps were marvels of inefficiency and discomfort. Tents, if you could call them that, were leaky, drafty affairs. The ground was either a dust bowl or a mud pit, depending on the whims of the weather gods, who clearly had a sadistic streak. And the food. Oh, the culinary delights continued. Stale, moldy hay was a delicacy. Water often tasted suspiciously of whatever upstream latrine it had recently passed through. And then there was the boredom. A soul-crushing, mind-numbing boredom, punctuated only by the routine miseries of camp life, being prodded for inspections, having your tack endlessly cleaned and re-cleaned by a rider who was probably just as bored as you were, and listening to the endless, boastful or mournful, depending on the outcome of the last slaughter, chatter of the humans. You'd think a bit of downtime would be welcome, a chance to heal. But you're sensing a theme. I hope even rest in a military camp sucked. There was no peace. Always noise, always movement, always the underlying tension that, at any moment, some idiot with a horn would blow it, and we'd be off again to play another round of dodge the pointy things. My shoulder throbbed. Other old wounds ached in sympathy. And the new ones, the ones etched not on my hide but on my psyche, those were the ones that really festered. The nightmares became a regular feature. I'd jerk awake, heart pounding, the phantom smell of blood in my nostrils, the screams of dying horses echoing in my ears. I'd see that dapple, gray mare, the spear. I'd feel the phantom pain of my own wound, fresh and agonizing. Therefore, sleep, when it came, was rarely restful. It was just another battlefield, one fought in the dark, terrifying confines of my own mind. And there was no rider there to tell me which way to charge, only the relentless replay of past horrors. Sometimes, if we were lucky, and I use that term with enough irony to power a small city, the war would take a breather, a proper lull. Maybe the humans had run out of pointy things, or enthusiasm for mutual evisceration, or perhaps they just needed to count their dead and recruit some fresh cannon fodder. During these periods, if our injuries weren't deemed career ending, we might be put to other, equally glamorous tasks. Hauling supplies, for instance, because what's more glorious for a noble steed than being turned into a glorified pack mule, lugging sacks of grain or barrels of questionable, all over-rutted, muddy tracks? The pay was the same, non-existent, and the appreciation level was roughly equivalent to what you'd give a particularly stubborn wheelbarrow. Or, if you were really unlucky, and your rider had shuffled off his mortal coil, or just decided he wanted a newer model, you might find yourself on the equine equivalent of the used car lot. Sold off. Passed on. Your fate decided by a bunch of hard-faced men haggling over your remaining useful years. I saw it happen. Horses that had charged bravely, that had carried their riders through hell and back, suddenly deemed surplus to requirements. Their eyes held a bewildered, betrayed look, but SLR, because sentimentality is the first casualty of war. Right after common-sensed war was a business, and we were just assets depreciating with every battle, every wound, every gray hair that appeared on our muzzles. One such, lull, found us garrisoned in some captured, half-ruined town. The novelty of not being actively shot at wore off pretty quickly, replaced by the grinding monotony and the ever-present discomfort. My shoulder had healed, sort of. It was stiff, and it ached in cold weather, a permanent souvenir of some anonymous enemy's enthusiasm. And then came the parades. Oh, joy. If the humans had won a particularly noteworthy scuffle, they liked to show off, which meant we, the surviving, somewhat less battered than others' horses, got to be tarted up with ribbons, sea itchy, and polished tack, still heavy, and paraded through streets lined with, well, mostly sullen, looking conquered people who probably wished we'd all just go away. We were supposed to look majestic, symbols of their might. I mostly just felt tired, sore, and vaguely embarrassed. Glory, it seemed, involved a lot of standing around looking bored while humans preened. During these lulls, you also got a real good look at the long-term effects of this charming lifestyle on your fellow equines. The older horses, the veterans of multiple campaigns, were a sorry sight. Scarred, often lame, with a haunted, 1,000-yard stare that spoke of too many battles, too much loss. Their spirits, if not entirely broken, were certainly bent into very odd shapes. They were jumpy, prone to fits of inexplicable terror at sudden noises, or, conversely, so dulled by trauma that they barely reacted to anything anymore. Therefore, they were a walking, whinnying advertisement for why this whole war horse career path was a one-way ticket to a very unhappy ending. I looked at them and saw my future, and let me tell you, it wasn't a pretty picture. It was mostly shades of gray, with occasional splashes of, ow, my leg, and please make it stop. And the humans, bless their violent little hearts, didn't get much better. The ones who survived, anyway. They were often just as scarred, just as haunted as we were, though they had better ways of hiding it, or drowning it in cheap boozy. Sometimes, a rider would form a genuine bond with his horse. I saw it, occasionally. A gentle hand, a shared apple, a soft word spoken when no one else was listening. But, and it's a heartbreaking, but, those moments were fleeting, fragile things, easily shattered by the next battle, the next order, the next pointless death. More often, we were just tools. Maintained, yes, because a broken tool is useless. But cared for, loved, that was a luxury few of us ever knew. The boredom of a long encampment could be almost as bad as the terror of a charge. Standing tethered for hours, days, weeks on end. The same patch of dirt. The same miserable view. The same flies buzzing around your head with a persistence that bordered on the demonic. You'd try to find small distractions. Watching the humans go about their bizarre, pointless routines, trying to steal an extra mouthful of grass from just beyond your rope's reach, usually resulting in a sharp tug and a cursed. Engaging in a bit of equine gossip with the horse tethered next to you, if he wasn't too busy reliving his own personal hell. Hear about old Thunderbolt. Got an arrow in the rump last Tuesday. They say he won't be justing again. Thrilling stuff. And then, just when you'd settled into a state of weary resignation, just when the nightmares had almost started to fade, just when you'd convinced yourself that maybe, just maybe, this particular round of human stupidity was over, the horns would blow again. The call to arms. The summons to another festival of agony. And the whole miserable cycle would start anew. The hurried preparations, the nervous energy, the long march, the gnawing fear, the why me? Why again? Can't someone else do the dying this time? Feeling. Because that's the ultimate suck of being a warhorse in a lull. It's not peace. It's not rest. It's just waiting. Waiting for the next horror. Waiting for the inevitable. You're a weapon, temporarily put back in the armory, but everyone knows you'll be drawn again. And each time you're drawn, you're a little more chipped, a little more blunted, a little closer to being discarded. The lulls weren't a reprieve, they were just the agonizingly slow tick, talk of a clock counting down to your next appointment with misery. And that, my friends, is a truly special kind of suck. It's the suck that seeps into your bones and whispers that there's no escape, only a series of increasingly unpleasant holding patterns before the final, messy crash. Part 5. Fleeting, bright, spots or moments that almost didn't entirely suck, okay? So after painting a picture so relentlessly grim, it probably makes a vulture's funeral look like a carnival. You might be wondering if there was ever a moment, just a tiny, flickering, nearly invisible spark in the vast, suffocating darkness of being a war horse that wasn't utterly, soul-crushingly awful. And the answer is, well, it's complicated. Like trying to explain quantum physics to a particularly dim-witted turnip. There were moments, yes, tiny, fleeting, and usually sandwiched between two much larger slices of pure, unadulterated suck. Think of them as finding a single, slightly bruised grape in an entire barrel of fermented misery. One of these, almost, didn't suck. Categories involved. Surprisingly enough, other horses. Misery, as they say, loves company. And when you're literally tethered next to another creature, enduring the same brand of institutionalized torture, a certain camaraderie can develop. It wasn't like we were braiding each other's manes and swapping gossip about which human had the worst breath. Though, between you and me, Sir Sweats, Lot was a strong contender. It was more subtle than that. A shared glance when a particularly idiotic order was given. A soft nicker of reassurance when the pre-battle jitters got too intense. The silent understanding that passed between two creatures who knew, without a word, just how royally screwed they both were. I remember one old gelding. a scarred veteran named Patches, who was tethered next to me for a particularly brutal winter campaign. He'd seen it all, done it all, and probably had the T-shirt C if horses wore T-shirts, which thankfully they don't. Can you imagine the chafing? He had this way of just being there. When the wind howled like a banshee and the rations were thinner than a miser's patience, he'd just stand, stoic, occasionally giving a low rumble in his chest that was, I think, his version of, "Yeah, this sucks, kid, but we'll get through it. Or we won't. Whatever. But puss." Because even camaraderie had its limits in this hellscape, Patches eventually got too old, too lame. One morning, he was just gone. No goodbye. No. It was nice knowing ya. Just another empty space. Another reminder that any connection you made was inherently temporary, likely to be severed by disease, injury, or a human's arbitrary decision. Therefore, even these small comforts were tinged with the bitter taste of impending loss. It was like making friends on death row. Heartwarming, in a really depressing sort of way. And then there were the humans. Now, hold on, before you accuse me of going soft, let me be clear. 99.9% of the time, humans were the architects of our misery, the oblivious or deliberately cruel overlords of our suffering. But and this is a tiny, microscopic, but like finding a single atom of gold in a mountain of dung, every now and then you'd encounter one that wasn't a complete, unadulterated monster. Sir Sweat's a lot, for all his, well, sweatness and his tendency to treat me like a slightly more intelligent wheelbarrow, wasn't actively malicious. He was just a product of his time, a cog in the war machine, probably as scared and miserable as I was, just better at hiding it or yelling about it. There were a few times, after a particularly nasty battle, when he actually seemed concerned. He'd check my wounds himself, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. He'd sneak me an extra apple, filched from somewhere, hissing at me to eat it quickly before anyone saw. These weren't grand gestures of affection. They were tiny, almost imperceptible cracks in the facade of military brutalism. But and it's a big, overshadowing, but these moments were rare. And they didn't change the fundamental dynamic. He was still the master, I was still the tool. Tomorrow, he'd still be yanking on my bit and kicking my ribs to make me charge into a wall of spears. So, while a stolen apple was nice, it didn't exactly make up for the existential dread and the constant threat of a pointy death. It was like being punched in the face repeatedly, and then the guy who punched you offers you a stick of gum. Thanks, I guess. I once saw a young recruit, a kid barely old enough to shave allers, if they even bothered with such niceties, who genuinely seemed to love his horse. A pretty little mare, she was. He'd spend hours grooming her, talking to her in a low, soft voice, sharing his meager rations. It was almost sweet. In a place utterly devoid of sweetness, you'd see them, a little island of quiet affection in a sea of chaos and brutality. It made you think, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, not all humans were complete psychopaths. But, and this, but, is a gut-punch war, has a way of destroying beautiful things. I saw them go into their first major battle. The kid was all gung-ho, trying to be brave. The mare was nervous, but she trusted him. Later that day, I saw the mare, riderless, wandering dazedly through the carnage, a terrible wound in her side. The kid never saw him again. Therefore, even witnessing a glimmer of genuine interspecies affection was just a setup for more heartbreak. It was like watching a beautiful sandcastle being built. Knowing the tide was coming in, it just made the eventual destruction more poignant, more sucky. Sometimes, the almost didn't suck. Moments were even simpler. A brief moment of quiet on a sunny afternoon, when the camp was relatively still, and you could just doze in the warmth, feeling the sun on your back. A drink of cool, clean water after a long, dusty march, so refreshing it almost made you forget, for a glorious 30 seconds, that you were probably going to be ridden into another bloodbath tomorrow. The feel of good, sweet grass under your hooves, if you were lucky enough to be turned out to graze in a field that hadn't been completely ravaged by the army. These were the small, animal pleasures, the remnants of a life that had been stolen from us. But elves, because the universe hates to see a war horse even momentarily content, these moments were always fleeting, always overshadowed by the knowledge of what was and what was to come. It was like enjoying a single, perfect strawberry while knowing the rest of the pint was full of mold. You savored it, but the underlying bitterness remained. The truth is, when your entire existence is predicated on suffering, violence, and the constant threat of death, even the smallest deviation from that baseline of awful can feel like a monumental reprieve. A slightly less lumpy patch of ground to sleep on. A day when your rider wasn't in a particularly fall mood. A battle where you didn't get stabbed much. These became the good old days you reminisced about, which really tells you something about the overall quality of your life, doesn't it? Remember that Tuesday when nobody tried to impale me? Ah, good times. It's a twisted sort of psychology, I suppose. Your brain, desperate for any scrap of positivity, latches onto these insignificant moments and blows them up into something more than they were. Because if you truly, fully acknowledged the unceasing, unrelenting suckiness of it all, you'd probably just lie down in the mud and refuse to get up ever again. And that, as we learned in training, was generally frowned upon and often led to a premature and unpleasant end. So, were there moments that didn't entirely suck? Yes, in the same way that a single drop of rain in the middle of a desert doesn't entirely suck. It's technically true, but it doesn't change the fundamental aridity of your situation. These moments were just brief interruptions, tiny commas in a very long, very badly written sentence of misery. They didn't make being a war horse good. They just made it, for a fleeting second or two, infinitesimally less bad. And in a life defined by varying degrees of bad, that, sadly, was about as good as it ever got. It was still, fundamentally, a raw deal. A cosmic joke where we were the unwilling, four-legged punchline. And that, my friends, is the ultimate, unvarnished truth of why it almost always sucked. Conclusion. The golden years, and the bitter end, or why retirement is just another word for slowly fading into oblivion. If you're lucky. So, here we are. After dragging you through the mud, blood, and general misery that constituted the glamorous career of yours truly, Windrider, war horse extraordinaire X and by extraordinaire, I mean, extraordinarily unlucky to have survived this long, we arrive at the grand finale. The happily ever after, if you will, except this isn't a fairy tale, And the only, ever, after, most war horses got was a shallow grave or the knacker's yard. But because life, even at its suckiest, loves a cruel twist, some of us, the particularly stubborn or inexplicably fortunate ones, actually made it through the active duty phase. And what awaited us on the other side? Let me tell you, it wasn't exactly a ticker, tape parade, and a lifetime supply of premium oats. If you were lucky, and by lucky, I mean not immediately sold off to pull a coal cart or turned into dog food the second the last battle horn faded, you might have found yourself in a sort of retirement. This retirement usually meant being put out to pasture. Quite literally. Sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Rolling green fields, lazy afternoons, no more pointy things coming at your face. But, Sebas, and it's a but, soaked in the wariness of 1,000 battles, even this so-called peace was just another shade of suck, albeit a quieter, more insidious one. For one thing, your body was usually a wreck. My shoulder, a souvenir from that enthusiastic spear, chucker, never quite healed right. It aged with every change in the weather, a dull, throbbing reminder of past glories, or, more accurately, past agonies. Old wounds, long forgotten sprains, the general wear and tear of years spent carrying heavy humans and heavier burdens, they all came back to haunt you in your golden years. You'd see us old veterans limping around the field, our once proud gaits reduced to a stiff, arthritic shuffle. We were like broken, down classic cars, left to rust in a field, occasionally admired for what we once were, but mostly just there. Therefore, retirement often meant a slow, uncomfortable decline, a daily battle against the ghosts of injuries past. And the mind? Oh, the mind was a whole other battlefield. The nightmares didn't just magically disappear when the wars ended. If anything, they had more room to roam, more quiet nights to fill with the screams and the stench and the terror. You'd see an old war horse, peacefully grazing, suddenly jerk its head up, ears pricked, eyes wide with a phantom fear, triggered by a falling branch or a distant shout. We were still fighting those battles, long after the trumpets had fallen silent. But because who cares about equine PTSD, right? There were no therapists for us, no support groups. Just the lonely, echoing corridors of our own traumatized memories. It was a special kind of hell, being haunted by a past you couldn't escape, in a present that offered little comfort. Sometimes, if your former rider had a shred of sentimentality or just nowhere else to dump you, you might end up on their estate. This could be a mixed bag. If they were decent, you might get a relatively comfortable stall and regular meals. But because decent is a relative term when it comes to humans and their former tools, you were still, essentially, a living relic, a reminder of their glory days. Kids might come to gawk at the brave war horse, maybe even try to sit on your aching back. You were a story, a legend, a piece of history. But you weren't really seen anymore, not as a living, feeling creature. You were a monument to their past, not an individual with your own present. And if you weren't lucky enough to land a cushy, by war horse standards, retirement spot, well, the options weren't great. Many of us were sold off. The strong ones, the ones who still had some go left in them, might end up pulling plows or carts or slogging away in some other menial, back-breaking labor until they dropped. from the glory of the battlefield to the anonymous toil of a beast of burden. It was a swift and brutal downgrade. Therefore, the peace so many humans fought for rarely extended to their four-legged comrades in arms. We were just disposable. I saw old Patches, my stoic winter campaign buddy, get sold to a tanner. A tanner. I don't need to spell out what that meant. One day he was there, sharing his cynical wisdom. The next, he was gone. His fate sealed by a few clinking coins. That's the thanks you got for years of loyal, life-threatening service. A one-way trip to becoming a pair of boots, or a nice, sturdy drum. It really, truly, makes you question the whole concept of loyalty, doesn't it? My own retirement, if you can call it that, was on the slightly less horrific end of the spectrum. Sir Sweat's lot, perhaps out of a misplaced sense of duty, or simply because I was too lame to fetch a good price, left me on his rather rundown country estate. I had a field, mostly weeds, and a leaky stable. It wasn't the Ritz, but it wasn't the knacker's yard either. Small mercies, I suppose. But because even in relative peace, the suck lingers, it was a lonely existence. The other horses were mostly farm animals, placid, unscarred creatures who couldn't possibly understand the things I'd seen, the things I'd done. I was an outsider, a relic, a ghost at their dull, pastoral feast. The days stretched out, long and monotonous. I'd stand in the field, watching the clouds drift by, replaying old battles in my head. Sometimes, a young stable boy, curious about the old war horse, would bring me a carrot. He'd ask about the scars, about the battles. I couldn't answer, of course. And even if I could, what would I say? Yeah, kid, it sucked. It sucked more than you can possibly imagine. And the carrots, they don't make up for it. The last dab, the final, lingering taste of why it sucked. So, there you have it. The grand, unvarnished, and deeply unpleasant truth about being a war horse. From the terror of capture to the brutality of training, from the hellish chaos of battle to the slow, aching decline of retirement. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't noble. It was a life sentence of fear, pain, and exploitation, punctuated by rare, fleeting moments that only served to highlight the overwhelming awfulness of the rest. We were born for freedom, for the wind in our manes and the earth beneath our hooves. But the ultimate but of our existence, we were conscripted into a world of human ambition, human violence, human folly. We charged when they yelled, charge. We bled when their enemies struck. We died in their pointless quarrels over patches of dirt or shiny trinkets. And then, if we were lucky enough to survive their wars, we were forgotten, discarded, left to fade away like the tattered banners of a vanquished army. They write poems about the heroes, the generals, the kings. They build statues to commemorate their victories. But, and this is the but, that echoes through the ages, where are the monuments to the millions of horses who carried them into those battles, who fell beneath them, whose blood soaked the very ground they claimed as their own? We were the silent, unsung casualties, the four-legged footnotes in their grand, bloody narratives. Our suffering was inconvenient, our sacrifices taken for granted. So, the next time you see a romantic painting of a knight on a valiant steed, the next time you read a stirring tale of cavalry charges and battlefield glory, take a moment. Think about the creature beneath the armor, the living, breathing being whose terror was as real as the soldiers, whose pain was just as acute. Think about the price we paid for their glory. Because, at the end of it all, when the dust settles and the historians write their books, the simple, unadorned truth remains: it really, truly, profoundly, and in every conceivable way sucked to be a war horse. And no amount of heroic ballads or stirring speeches can ever change that fundamental, hoof-stompingly awful fact. We were just along for the ride. And what a terrible, terrible ride it was. The end. And thank goodness for that.